evening, everybody. This is the House Call with Dr. Rob. I am Dr. Rob Stinson. I appreciate you joining me tonight. I look forward to this every week, getting to hang out with you guys and have the privilege of discussing the greatest sport in the history of the world, the sport of professional wrestling. Like me, many of you grew up with Stu Sachs, Pro Wrestling Illustrated, and the whole family of magazines that formed part of that PWI series of publications. I'm thinking about The Wrestler, Inside Wrestling, the Victory Sports Series magazines. Remember, they had the little Victory Sports Series circle at the top of the publication. In fact, that Inside Wrestling was usually my favorite because it had the roll call of champions in the back. I used to consult that. I'd keep my own little notebooks. I loved that. I spent all my allowance on that growing up. My favorite single issue of the year, however, usually and still does appear around January or February of each of the year. It's the March PWI issue, and this has always been reserved for the PWI end of year superlatives, the end of year awards, the most popular wrestler, match of the year, all that stuff. And just last week, I received my 2020 end of year superlative issues in the mail. And I actually bought this on the newsstand because I get mine a little bit later, but I wanted to read the write-up about Thunder Rosa in there. But I got my issue in the mail just this week. And of course, the cover is graced by Orange Cassidy, who wins most popular wrestler of the year. And true to his persona, he's got the plaque upside down. It's a really clever picture there and a nice looking cover. But the end of year magazine is more than just superlatives. It is a comprehensive look at the highs and lows of the year. It's a celebration of the previous year for good or ill. And as I turn the pages of this issue, you're going to see, a month by month retelling of what happened, all the major title changes. I mean, it's really, really a very good and comprehensive publication. This particular issue, Medusa Michelli, is winning the Stanley Weston Award. So I encourage you to go back and look at that. Medusa, of course, is one of the all-time greats. Stu Sachs retired this year and handed over the reins of leadership at PWI to his successor. But just a great publication. And as I turned the pages of this magazine, I thought it'd be fun over the next 2 episodes of the House Call to reflect on a bold claim that I've made multiple times on my social media boards, on the This Is Pro Wrestling live streams. And that assertion has always been that 1986 is the greatest year in the history of pro wrestling. So I've used the occasion of the 2020 retrospective to initiate a retrospective on the year 1986, which I feel is the greatest year in wrestling of all time. Now, obviously, this is purely opinion, and it's only worth as much as you think my opinion is worthwhile. There are many other years that are often suggested as perhaps the greatest of all time. You, of course, got 2002, 1982, 1996. And I'm sure that out there in the great masses of wrestling fans, every year is represented. There is someone that will say that any particular year is the greatest year of all time. So saying that one year is better than the other is far from objective. It is autobiographical. It tells us a lot about ourselves, more so than what it states about the sport of professional wrestling or what was going on that year. For me, my earliest memories are of wrestling, always. I can't remember a time when I didn't know and love wrestling. I remember Mad Dog Buzz Sawyer, Tommy Wildfire Rich, Gordon Soley, the Fabulous Freebirds. These are the distinctive memories that I have growing up. I have memories going back, distinctive memories going back to 1979, 1980, around that time frame. But for me, and maybe it was just the fact that I was maturing and becoming much more aware, 1986 was the year that got me. That's the year that I became fully invested, that wrestling was #1 tops. And now I got a lot of passions in my life. I've always liked rock and roll. I love the Atlanta Braves. I'm a huge baseball fan. I like my Georgia Bulldogs. But for me, nothing compares to pro wrestling. And with that being said, no year has ever surpassed the greatness of 1986. And today and on Friday, I'm going to tell you why that is. So I am proud to present to you the House Call's 10 Reasons Why 1986 is the greatest year in wrestling history. Okay. Number 10 is, surprisingly for an NWA guy, it's actually a WWF endeavor, the Sam Muchnick Tournament. This was a tournament promoted by the World Wrestling Federation, held at the Kiel Auditorium in St. Louis, Missouri, which of course was the legendary territory of Sam Muchnick, the great icon of the National Wrestling Alliance. And this featured a 16-man single elimination tournament. Now, it was headlined by Hulk Hogan versus Paul Orndorff. And for many of you who know me know that I'm a huge fan of Paul Orndorff, maybe my favorite WWF star of all time. I actually have this baseball that Mr. Wonderful signed for me. He took great pains. I mean, look at he took time to write that out and sign it. And he inscribed main event. Let's see if you can see that in the lighting there. Main event of WrestleMania #1. And just very gracious. We spent a great deal of time talking and got to spend several hours and a couple of beverages with him. It was one of my great events, but I fell in love with, I've always been in love with Paul Orndorff, and he's been one of my favorites, but that is not why this event ranks as my number 10 reason 1986 was the greatest year in pro wrestling. For me, you got to remember going back in time that 1986 was a time when the WWF did not acknowledge anybody else. As far as they were concerned, the WWF was the only promotion in the world. There was no NWA, there was no World Wrestling Council, no AWA, no World Class, none of that. And for the WWF to promote an event called the Sam Muchnick Tournament in St. Louis, Missouri, showed a lot of maturity and a lot of diplomacy on the part of the WWF. And this tournament, the 16-man tournament, was the bomb. I mean, it featured guys like Brian Blair, the great Don Morocco, Greg the Hammer Valentine, Adrian Adonis, JYD, Brutus the Barber Beefcake, Pedro Morales, Pacific Northwest legend Billy Jack Haynes, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. I mean, it was stacked. 4 rounds, a first round, a quarterfinal, a semifinal, and a final. Let me read you how this played out, okay? In the first round, Harley Race pinned Brian Blair. Don Morocco and Greg Valentine were both eliminated by double disqualification. Adrian Adonis pinned King Tonga. Hercules Hernandez was pinned by the Junkyard Dog. Brutus Beefcake pinned Lanny Poffo. Pedro Morales pinned the great Dory Funk Jr. Jim Brunzel was pinned by Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. Okay, so you got a lot of NWA names represented in this, from Harley Race to Junkyard Dog to Billy Jack Haynes to Dory Funk Jr. to Ricky Steamboat. A lot of guys with steep history and ties to both the WWF, but also the NWA. In the quarterfinals, Harley Race advanced through a bye. The Junkyard Dog beat Adrian Adonis. Brutus Beefcake beat Pedro Morales, and Ricky Steamboat beat Billy Jack Haynes. In the semifinals, Harley Race beat Junkyard Dog, and Ricky Steamboat beat Brutus Beefcake to set up the match for the finals. And appropriately, the winner of the Sam Muchnick Tournament on August 29, 1986 was Harley Race, defeating Ricky Steamboat by submission at 7 minutes and 4 seconds. So number 10, the Sam Muchnick Tournament. Number 9, Jim Cornette versus Baby Doll. Okay, now, the first crush in my life was the lovely Baby Doll, the perfect 10. She was then, and she still is now, the perfect 10. I remember being jealous of Tully Blanchard. I remember being jealous of Dusty Rhodes when she was with Rhodes. I remember being jealous of Flair. I remember being jealous, of course, when she married Sam Houston. You can then imagine my outrage on the night in April 1986 when Jim Cornette and the Midnight Express had that encounter with Dusty Rhodes and Baby Doll. It started out where Jim Cornette and Midnight Express had come to the ring to wrestle a preliminary team. They demolished them, were attacking them with the belts, and they started trash talking Dusty. Dusty came out to the ring. Of course, at the time, he was accompanied to the ring by Baby Doll. And the melee ensued. And in the course of the melee, Jim Cornette, breaking all kinds of rules and expectations about how a man should treat a woman, especially in those days. Now, this was prior to the Attitude Era, okay? But Jim Cornette hit Baby Doll in the abdomen with that notorious tennis racket. And, Baby Doll was injured. She was out for a while. And that set up a feud that would play out during the Great American Bash that year between Baby Doll and Jim Cornette. But for me, I remember just frothing in anger and just being completely, totally, sincerely concerned about the health and well-being of Baby Doll. And for me, that feud, the Jim Cornette Baby Doll feud, was the number 9 reason why 1986 was the greatest year in pro wrestling. Number 8, again, a WWF entry here, okay? WrestleMania 2. this was at the height of Hulkamania. This was a time when Hulk Hogan was impervious to injury. He truly was immortal. In my mind, as a kid, 10 years old in those days, he could not be touched. And so it came as shock to me that King Kong Bundy exposed Hulk Hogan for being a human being. In fact, not immortal. Uh, I remember Hogan was wrestling the Magnificent Morocco. It was March of 1986. And at some point in this match, Bundy runs in Morocco and Bundy are tag teaming Hogan. They're just pounding him. And then, of course, um, Bundy delivered that infamous avalanche. That press, that full body press on the ribs of Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan's ribs were broken and he was out for some time. He was advised not to compete. Nevertheless, Hogan accepted King Kong Bundy's challenge with the tape around his ribs. I remember the cage, those big blue bars. It wasn't like the cages that we had down in the South, the steel mesh. They had these huge blue bars. And I remember that match being one where I thought that Hulk Hogan might be badly injured and that might be the end. I mean, this is what I'm thinking as a 10-year-old. At the start of the match, now this was the third of 3 main events. Remember, there was a main event coming to you from New York. That was Roddy Piper and Mr. T in a boxing match refereed by Smoking Joe Frazier. There was the match in Chicago between the British Bulldogs and the Dream Team, Greg Valentine and Brutus Beefcake. We're going to talk about that later. And then, of course, this was the big prize. The LA match was Hogan and Bundy. And at the start, of course, Bundy removed Hogan's rib tape. And the match went back and forth. Bundy was really dominant in the match. But ultimately, Hogan was able to kick out of another avalanche and was able to climb the steel cage. Bundy catches Hogan's legs. Nevertheless, Hogan kicked Bundy, climbed over the top of the steel cage, and down to the floor to win the match and retain the title. The stipulation, of course, was to win the match. All you had to do was either get a pinfall, a submission, or climb the cage. After the match, Hogan catches Bobby the Brain Heenan inside the cage, and as Bundy was reeling from the match, Hogan rammed Heenan's head into the cage before putting him in the atomic drop, and that was history. Number 8, all-time reason why 1986 was the greatest year of all time, WrestleMania 2, Hulk Hogan versus King Kong Bundy. Number 7, in the 1980s, World Class owned Texas. And for 5 years, the Cotton Extravaganza came to us from the Cotton Bowl in Dallas, Texas. Now, they did this each year from 84 to 88 or 89. I can't quite remember. But this one, the third annual, the 1986 Cotton Bowl Extravaganza, was by far the best. Looking at the matches, you had Kevin Von Erich, the Barefoot Warrior, winning the WCWA World Championship from Black Bart. You had Ricky Steamboat, who was under contract with the WWF at the time, making a rare out-of-promotion appearance, winning his match against the Mighty Zulu. You had Mike Von Erich defeating Spike Johnson, and of course, the greatest match, one of the greatest matches ever, certainly one of the greatest matches of 1986, the legendary match between Bruiser Brody and Abdullah the Butcher in the steel cage. You want to talk about two guys who were larger than life, who scared me as a kid, who were among the most brutal, most extreme wrestlers well before there was a time of extremities in pro wrestling. These guys were bringing barbed wire, fire, spikes, forks to the ring well before anybody in the East Coast Independence or Philadelphia, Pennsylvania were even dreaming it. And Bruiser Brody defeated Abdullah the Butcher in a steel cage match. By the way, the special referee in that match, Fritz Von Erich, which brings us to number 6. And this is not going to be a surprise to anybody, especially to my good friend Will Martin. Number 6 was the Jim Crockett Senior Memorial Cup. There have been 4 Crockett Cups, 1986, 1987, 1988, and then 2019, the reinstitution of the Cup. This was the Jim Crockett inaugural Senior Memorial Cup. And of course, we spoke about on TikTok how Flair always seemed to make an imprint on this, and Flair did wrestle Dusty Rhodes in the singles main event, put the title on the line. But this night was all about tag teams, and there were a number of great tag teams represented in this tournament. You had Wahoo McDaniel and Jay Youngblood. You had Fantastics. You had the Sheep Herders. You had Ronnie Garvin and Magnum TA. And, of course, you had Hawk and Animal, the Road Warriors. And at the end of the night, the winners of the first ever Jim Crockett Senior Memorial Cup were the Road Warriors defeating Ronnie Garvin and Magnum TA. Now, you can see so far that 1986 was quite a year. If we left it at just that, we could make a credible argument that 1986 was the greatest year of all time. But we're not going to stop there, guys. We have much more to go. Join us this Friday as we conclude the list that proves that 1986 was the greatest year in wrestling history. This is Dr. Rob Stinson. This is the House Call, and you're in good hands. We'll see you next time.